55 feet below shattered Berlin. The air in the Führerbunker chokes with damp concrete, sweat, and burnt paper. It is late April 1945. Adolf Hitler, trembling with palsy, stands over a table. Not a war map, but a miniature city, Linz. His shaking hand reaches out, not for an army, but to gently touch a tiny opera house. As Soviet shells hammer the ceiling above, he smiles. It's a smile you would not have survived. This wasn't a military commander assessing defeat. This was something far darker. Why would a leader, facing absolute ruin, order the systematic destruction of his own country? Every bridge, every mine, every last bushel of grain. And what does it say about the world you live in today? That the architecture of this exact betrayal is being built right now, somewhere you would never expect. To understand what happens in that bunker, you need to erase the black and white newsreels from your mind and picture the color of the world in the first months of 1945. Imagine a sky over Germany that is permanently gray, not from weather, but from the smoke of burning cities. The Allied bombing campaigns had reduced places like Dresden and Hamburg to landscapes from a nightmare, collections of hollowed-out buildings and rubble-choked streets. From the west, the American, British, and French armies had crossed the Rhine, the last natural barrier protecting the German heartland. From the east, the Soviet war machine, an unstoppable force of millions of men fueled by vengeance, had smashed through the German lines on the Oder River and was now less than 50 miles from Berlin. Inside the Reich, the civilian population was starving, surviving on watery soup and bread made with sawdust. The once mighty Wehrmacht was a ghost, its ranks filled with old men and teenage boys, some as young as 12, armed with single-shot anti-tank weapons and a few days of indoctrination. The Germany that Hitler had promised would last for 1,000 years was, by any rational measure, already dead. The war was over. Everyone knew it, from the generals at the front to the families huddled in their basements. You have to remember that what followed was not a desperate last attempt to win. It was a choice. A deliberate, calculated decision made by the man in the bunker to punish a world that had refused to bend to his will, and a people who he now believed had failed him. But the precise nature of that punishment was far more chilling than mere military defeat. The self-destruction did not begin with a single order, but with a creeping, systemic madness that infected the entire Nazi high command as the end drew near. If you had been a fly on the wall in the bunker's conference room during those final months, you would have witnessed scenes of pure delusion. Hitler would spend hours a day hunched over maps, directing armies that no longer existed. He would move the pins representing the 11th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Felix Steiner, ordering it to counterattack and encircle the Soviets, oblivious to the fact that Steiner's army was a cobbled-together collection of a few thousand exhausted men with no fuel and almost no ammunition. His generals would stand in silence, their faces pale, not daring to tell him the truth. They understood this was no longer strategy, but a grim ritual. They watched him perform his power in a vacuum, knowing that outside the bunker, telex machines were already chattering with the real orders. On March 19, 1945, Hitler signed what would become known as the Nero Decree. Its official title was Demolitions on Reich Territory, and its text was chillingly clear. It was a scorched earth order for Germany itself. Every single piece of infrastructure that could conceivably be of use to the advancing enemy was to be obliterated. You must understand the scale of this. This wasn't just bridges and railways. The order specified all industrial plants, all electrical facilities, all waterworks, gasworks, all food and provision stores. It was an order to methodically dismantle the very skeleton of a modern nation, ensuring that whoever survived the war would starve or freeze to death in the ruins. The man tasked with overseeing this plan was Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments. But Speer, a man who had orchestrated the Nazi war machine for years, finally saw the nihilistic endpoint of the ideology he served. He decided to disobey. He flew across what was left of Germany in a rickety plane, landing on improvised runways, meeting with Gauleiters and army commanders in secret. He would show them the telexed order from the Führer, the paper still crisp, and then he would appeal to them, not to their morality, but to their self-preservation. He argued that to obey this order was to condemn their own families, their own people, to a dark age. Some listened. Many did not. In cities like Breslau, the fanatical Gauleiter Karl Hanke reportedly followed the scorched earth policy to the letter, turning the city into a fortress and vowing to fight to the last stone, a decision that cost over 80,000 civilian lives. The tension was not between Germany and the Allies anymore. It was an internal war. A civil war fought in whispers and coded messages between those who wanted to survive and those who were determined to drag the entire nation down into the grave with their leader. If you had been one of those regional commanders, holding that telex in your hand, the sound of approaching artillery a constant drumbeat in the distance, you would have faced an impossible choice. Betray your Führer and risk immediate execution by the SS, or betray your people and condemn them to a generation of misery. Here's the detail that would have made your blood run cold. The Nero decree contained a specific clause stating that any attempt to plead for the civilian population was to be considered treason. Hitler knew people would object on humanitarian grounds, and he preemptively made compassion a crime punishable by death. The worst part hadn't happened yet. The true betrayal wasn't written on a government decree. It was spoken quietly in the close, suffocating air of the bunker, and it was a judgment passed not on the enemy, but on his own people. In a late-night conversation with his secretary, Traudl Junge, Hitler finally articulated the monstrous logic behind his actions. He was told that the German people were suffering, that they were fighting and dying with incredible bravery. He listened, his face a cold, emotionless mask. And then he reportedly replied that if the war was lost, the nation would also perish. He believed this was an unavoidable fate, and that there was no need to consider the basis even for a most primitive existence. On the contrary, he continued, it was better to destroy these things themselves, because this nation would have proved to be the weaker one, and the future would belong solely to the stronger Eastern nation. In any case, only those who were inferior would remain after this struggle, for the good had already been killed. Think about the person you trust the most in the world. Imagine you have given everything for them, your loyalty, your labor, your children's lives. Now imagine them looking you in the eye and telling you that your suffering means nothing, that your sacrifice was worthless, and that your death is not a tragedy, but a biological necessity. It was the ultimate statement of contempt. The German people had not been fighting for Germany. They had been fighting for him. And now that he had failed, he declared them unfit to live. And here's what should make you deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't a sudden psychotic break. It was the endpoint of a system that had been in place for over a decade. The idea of destroying everything in defeat was not new. You just have to look at how the Wehrmacht had behaved during its long retreat from the Soviet Union. From 1943 onwards, they practiced a systematic scorched earth policy, destroying thousands of villages, poisoning wells, and tearing up hundreds of miles of railway tracks. What Hitler ordered for Germany in 1945 was simply the same policy he had always applied to his enemies. He was now treating his own country as enemy territory. This wasn't chaos. It was a horrifyingly consistent application of his worldview. The coordination was terrifyingly efficient. Special demolition squads, known as Sprengkommandos, were formed. Detailed lists were drawn up, cataloging every bridge, every factory, every power station. Telexes were sent from the bunker, which was now completely cut off from the outside world, and in many places, these orders were still being followed with bureaucratic precision. Gauleiters, the regional Nazi party leaders, became the high priests of this new death cult. They would give rousing speeches to teenage boys, sending them on suicide missions against Soviet tanks, while secretly preparing to flee themselves. They declared their cities fortresses, which was a death sentence for every civilian trapped inside. The system of control that the Nazis had perfected over 12 years was now turned inward, becoming a finely tuned engine of self-annihilation. It was a machine designed to consume everything, and when there was nothing left outside to burn, it simply began to burn itself. But all of this, the scorched earth, the betrayal, still doesn't explain the final, secret project Hitler was trying to protect, a phantom stronghold hidden deep in the mountains of Austria. It was a place the Allies feared more than anything. It was called the Alpine Fortress. The Alpine Fortress, the secret redoubt promised by Nazi propaganda, was in fact a deliberate and masterful lie. What you now understand, and what most people never will, is that Hitler's final doomsday plan was not a weapon, but a story. The reports described a vast, impregnable network of underground factories, secret weapons facilities, and fortifications being built deep within the Alps of southern Germany and Austria. It was to be the final redoubt of the Nazi regime, defended by 250,000 elite SS troops, from which they could wage a guerrilla war for years, even decades. General Eisenhower reportedly took the threat so seriously that he altered the entire strategic direction of the Allied advance. Instead of making a single decisive thrust towards Berlin, he diverted powerful American armies south towards the supposed fortress, fearing a prolonged and bloody mountain war. But the fortress was a lie. It was perhaps the most brilliant and cynical piece of propaganda ever conceived by Joseph Goebbels. There was no vast network of tunnels. There were no elite SS armies waiting in the mountains. While some minor construction had taken place, the entire concept of the Alpine fortress was a ghost, a strategic phantom deliberately created to deceive the Allies. And it worked perfectly. It diverted Allied forces. It prolonged the war. And most importantly, it gave the dying regime one last piece of hope to sell to its own people. It was a reason for the child soldiers in Berlin to keep fighting. It was a justification for the Nero decree. They weren't destroying Germany. They were just clearing the way for the retreat to the mountains. The systemic truth is this: the ultimate weapon of the Nazi regime was not the V-2 rocket or the jet fighter. It was the manipulation of reality itself. It was the ability to create a shared delusion so powerful that people would sacrifice their lives, their children's lives, and their entire country for a future that was a deliberate fiction. This wasn't about winning a war. It was about controlling the narrative until the very last second, ensuring that the final act of the German nation was one of self-immolation for a cause that its own leaders knew was a fraud. You see this pattern today. You see it in political movements that create alternate realities, in ideologies that demand loyalty to a future that never arrives. The real horror of the Alpine fortress is not that it was a weaponized mountain. It's that it was a weaponized idea, and that kind of weapon is still being built all around you. The answer to the question you've been sitting with this entire video, why a man would choose to annihilate the very people who had followed him with religious devotion, is this. In his mind, the contract had been broken. His worldview was purely Darwinian. He believed he had been chosen by Providence to lead the German people to their destiny as the master race. For 12 years, their victories had proven him right. But their defeat in 1945 proved in his mind that they were unworthy of his vision. They had failed the test. The German people were no longer the master race he had imagined. They were a biological disappointment. Therefore, they had forfeited their right to exist. The destruction ordered by the Nero decree was not a military tactic. It was a eugenics program enacted on a national scale. He was not the leader of Germany failing his country. He was a god judging his creation and finding it flawed. The scorched earth policy was him wiping the slate clean. It was the ultimate expression of narcissistic rage. If the world I created has failed me, then that world must be uncreated. It was never about Germany. It was only and ever about him. We return to the man in the bunker, 55 feet underground, gently touching the roof of a miniature opera house. He is not seeing a building. He is seeing a memory of a dream of a world that existed only in his mind. And he has decided to burn down the real world for its failure to live up to his fantasy. This pattern, the leader who promises a glorious future and then demands his followers die for his own personal failure, is not confined to history. You see its shadow every time a movement demands absolute loyalty, every time a leader declares that they alone can fix things, every time the failure to achieve an impossible goal is blamed not on the goal but on the follower's lack of faith. The bunker is gone, but the blueprints for how to build one in the human mind are never lost. Subscribe, because the stories that are forgotten are the ones most likely to happen again.